And Kathy has furnished minutes of our last meeting. And I understand there might be one change. But anything else come up yet? It doesn't look like memory.
I haven't seen anything else, Gary. The only thing I noticed is down in the bottom paragraph of the first page, there was a reference to vehicle mileage, and it was over 300,000 miles. I think that number was over 100,000 miles.
Okay.
I'm perfectly comfortable approving the minutes conditionally on validating what the right number was and putting the right number in there and publishing the minutes, but that would be my recommendation.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same. All right, subject to confirming that mileage number. And there was a lot of detail in our last meeting discussed. So it's possible that number got mixed.
Possible and probable. Common sense, but
Karina sent the latest spreadsheet, and thank you for that. Were you able to see that, Jeff, or?
Yes, I've seen it. I've been reviewing it.
Okay,
Is there a quick version of what was changed or added or whatever?
Fleet noted in their comments that they changed a little bit. I don't know exactly what they changed. Recreation and golf added the prioritizations.
yeah, I think the main thing we were after was their interpretation of the
I mean,
high, medium, or
Yeah.
low.
Yeah, because it sounded like, based on the conversation that we had, it sounded like maybe some of the things that were on the list weren't necessarily the highest priority items.
That's what it looks like when you look at their prioritization, especially for recreation.
And I apologize, I haven't seen the latest tables that just popped up in my email here in the last couple of minutes, so probably a couple of steps behind some of the rest of you.
Okay. There were some email exchanges. I think the latest I saw was either Larry or Jeff, let's see, April 7. Had attachments with the comparing notes in either red or blue ink.
I was the last guy to pile into that one. I think, Gary, since I kind of got the dot to carry this information over to the future revenue team, where we're trying to get to, just for open kimono here in the conversation, what we're trying to get to is to understand, from a O&M standpoint for the next 7 years, what's really, if you'll excuse the phrase, what's really the number to borrow the line from Nick Garrison. And we're pretty close based on the data that we saw. The concern and the reason we asked for the go back for prioritization was if you actually take all of the capital requests and all of the other budget associated with that effort, and you add it all up, it creates a number that is pretty much unaffordable. It's such a large number, it would require a significant number of additional dollars per month to be able to go close that gap, and it just doesn't look achievable. So one of the purposes of going back and putting a high, medium, low prioritization on it is to say, okay, let's start with the high priority stuff and understand where that target is, and then there'd be medium on top of that, low on top of that, to give us an idea of where those steps are in the process. So I think we're well on the way to getting that. There's a couple of places where recreation was one of the ones we wanted to take a look at. Looks like golf has done an update for prioritization. I was just talking to Karina on the side here a couple minutes ago. It looks like the food and beverage sheet probably needs to be updated to reflect the divestiture of the 3 restaurants to Explore. It looks like the numbers are still the same from the previous submittal. And that sounds like that's a pretty good money saver. So it'd be nice to have that updated, because that basically translates into cash from operations from
You're gonna save about $500,000 on the expense side. Now that hasn't looked at the revenue that would be coming off, so
Mhm.
your savings wouldn't be quite that great, but
Okay.
I'll
Yeah, it
go
would-
in and update that.
yeah, it would be good. It would be good to have that table updated so we can carry that forward. The other thing, I went through this, and other folks may have different positions, but the other thing I did is I went through some of the tabs, looking for some of the higher dollar items, trying to understand 2 things. The first thing was, what are we getting for the dollars that are there? In terms of, miles of this or yards of that, or whatever the equation was. And then the other part of that was, are there places where we might look at extending the timeline on those things beyond 7 years, to be able to shape the budget demands a little bit differently. So I went through and I found 7 or 8 items that I would like to go back to the staff with specific questions just in those items. I don't want to chase 550 entries in the spreadsheets, but there's 7 or 8 items that I think we need to understand either what we're getting for the dollars, or we need to have a dialogue about how many dollars will it take to get to a certain threshold, and try to understand what that looks like. I think if we can get through, from my standpoint, if we can get through those items, we've got about as good a look at what the future is going to hold as we're going to get. Would I like to know about some of the other things that are in here? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I kind of scratch my head about, that I'm kind of curious about, but I don't think they're going to move that bottom line number around all that much. So as much as I'd like to, explore my engineering side and go delve down into that, I don't think it's necessarily where we want to spend effort right now. So I don't know what everybody else's feeling is on that, but from my standpoint, if I can get some of those big rock questions answered, then I think we have enough information to at least be able to take that operations and maintenance data, put it into our projection models over on the future revenue side, and be able to start understanding what the financial needs are, and be able to start briefing the board, and be able to start having those conversations.
So you're calling that next step. You need, which department did I?
Well, so I've got several specifics. Food and beverage, we need to get an updated food and beverage tab. We've already gotten recreation. We've already gotten golf. Those were 2 other items I'd noted. I've got 3 or 4 things so I've got mostly in streets, a couple questions in sanitation, a couple questions in public utilities, but I don't have, basically there are about 8 or 9 line items that are actually in the budget right now.
What's your
Okay.
feeling so far?
I think maybe kind of sort of like Larry. I actually have like a 15-minute diatribe. But like Larry, I write them down first. So, Jeff, can you see this? Can you read this?
I can, no.
Okay.
We're gonna test this.
I think you can just squint, shouldn't be a problem. I'll just either read off of this or one of you guys want to take a picture of it and send it to,
I can do that. Hang on, I can text it to Jeff. Hang on a second.
I can get started while you're doing that.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So a quick look over our shoulder. What are we supposed to be doing here? I keep on going back to that. It doesn't move around that much, but I like things in writing, and I realize how difficult it is to nail this baby down. But anyway, I said, I think our goal is to identify POA maintenance funding needs through 2027. That seems to be what we're actually doing. Focus a whole lot more on expenses, less on funding. It's pretty impossible to talk about this subject without talking about funding, but we're really looking at primarily what's called capital expenses, but also operating expenses. I think we seem to be making a lot of progress on prioritization, particularly with the definition of high, medium, low. Right now, we're working with two major inputs, the OM tables, which seem to be almost in its final throes. And one thing I kept on going back to was the definition of high, medium, and low priorities. So I hope to just talk about that for a few minutes and make sure that I'm on the same page as everybody else. I gotta agree with Larry. The first version and even the current version has roughly about 87 million of capital requests in the OM table through 2027. I think we've all had a peek at Larry's high, medium, and low summaries. I think that's a really valuable tool. I don't see it moving a lot, but I think there is wiggle room in each of the line items. High of the, well, Larry has it as $80 million. The high is $60 million. I don't know that there's a whole lot of wiggle room there as a percentage, but it's the biggest number. The mediums is $14 million, a fair amount of dollars in there. That has more wiggle room. And the low is $4.5 million, even more wiggle room, but not that many dollars. So I have to agree that going forward, you can probably take those numbers as pretty indicative of what we're working with. My next statement is need prioritization for other departments. That seems to be have been done. I just haven't looked at it yet. So I think that's probably crossed that one off the list. Okay, the definition of high, medium, and low. I've stared at that a fair amount. If you go down to the bottom of the page, Jason sent out a definition which we seem to be using, and there's a possibility that we're setting a precedent that will be used in the future. So to me, it's pretty important. Plus, in terms of convincing ourselves, the board, staff, voters, that this is a solid definition. Nobody's going to agree on any definition whatsoever, but I'm starting to like it. But I'll just read the high one, and then the medium and low sort of build off of the high. Must be budgeted for prescribed amount, cannot function nor complete the primary mission in this area without this funding. The two things that strike me about this definition is the dollar amounts are pretty well set. I think there's some wiggle room in some of the areas, but that's the general idea. Cannot function or complete the primary mission. I understand that, except with the what is the primary POA mission? So with that, I go to the webpage and just copy our mission statement. And our mission statement says, in Hot Springs Village, our mission is to provide opportunities and lifestyle choices from the most vibrant to the peaceful and serene for all property owners and visitors alike. When I read that, it strikes me as a mission that's primarily constructed for people from the outside looking in. It really doesn't hammer on stuff like, are the roads collapsing? Or are the buildings on fire? having said that, those are mandatory things. You know, we can have the world's best golf courses in the universe or, you know, whatever. And you still need the roads, you still need the buildings. So even though it doesn't really focus primarily on infrastructure, that's simply a given. However, too many times when I listen to other conversations, it tends to sound like infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. And for those voters, I'm a little bit concerned that when they see things like bunkers, their automatic knee-jerk reaction is no. I've heard that from board candidates. And I mean, I'm gonna, you know, for instance, you know, pick on lakes, which is unusual for this group. As far as I know, those lakes haven't been dredged in 50 years. Lakes is really one of the crown jewels of this place. And maintaining those lakes is really important. So I don't have too much problems thinking in terms of, yeah, we should dredge those lakes once. Maybe at that point, we just figure out, okay, we've dredged them once, now what do we want to do? But that's kind of, that goes towards, when I look at that, the mission statement is most vibrant in the peaceful and serene and providing lifestyle. However, when you look at the total dollars, most of the dollars, they're going to go to infrastructure. But anyway, that's what I'm thinking. That's what's in my head. But I think it's the definition of what do we consider to be a high priority of this committee. The foundation that these statements provide is pretty solid. I do like that. So anyway, when I said the definition of high, medium, and below, I think that there are two standards for the definition. One is a narrower definition, which is what do you need to keep HSV running and functioning? And I think that's what a lot of people think, first of all. But the broader definition then steps up to include provide opportunities and lifestyle choices most vibrant, peaceful, and serene. Because ultimately, that speaks to, you know, kind of our soul, what this village wants to be. And all the other stuff, yeah, we really need it, without a doubt. But let's not forget the lifestyle point of view. I think Larry touched on my next bunch of points already, but when I look at a line item, I think in terms of, do we need what is requested? And the reality is pretty much there are 500 line items, and I'm hard pressed to point out a whole lot of them, or even a handful of them that we don't need in one manner or another. It really just depends on how do you define the word need, which I talked about a little bit a few minutes ago. Is the dollar amount reasonable? Quite frankly, we bought enough, backhoes and, Durangos to know what one of these babies costs. You can get quotes all day long, but when you look at big, long projects like, roads, fixing culverts, it's hard for me to conceive, are the dollar amounts reasonable? The numbers that I see in the budget, a lot of them, either you're going to be doing these things way beyond 7 years, or like culverts, whatever's in there ain't enough. So are they reasonable? You're not going to finish. So it's hard for me to say that they're not reasonable. And then it's not clear to me that what we are supposed to address. How is if they get that amount of dollars, how is it going to be spent? I personally don't like to get into operational decisions. And we are relying heavily on the staff to make those decisions. And I think Larry mentioned this. What is the result? What's the impact? What did we get out of it? For some of these long-term projects, at the end of 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, what's changed? What's different? How have we benefited? Junk like that. I'm not too sure how much this committee is supposed to get into that topic. And I make the sort of the summary statement. Are those questions obviated because we don't have the expertise? I can flat out say, when I look at water and sewer, that stuff is so technical. You know, I don't know nothing about pumps and, you know, lift stations and junk like that. If somebody says we need one, I kind of shrug my shoulders and say, I suppose so. That's why we supposed to have a general manager. But that ain't me. And like I said, I'm not an operations guy. I state the question, but it's probably a leading question. How much do we rely on staff expertise that the funds will be appropriately spent? Like it or not, in the world that I see and hear too often is people, no matter what the decision, people are always going to criticize or question or take shots at, is the money being spent wisely? You know, can we do this? Can we do that? One of the issues that we mentioned very early on are what alternatives are there? We haven't gone a lot into that. You know, we have a limitation of time, and certainly we have a limitation of expertise. Those are probably the big fat philosophical things that I guess I've been thinking about. I'm not too sure, but I think just what I've said pretty much should give you a pretty good idea of what I'm thinking anyway. We also talk, there are a couple other things in there. It says road trips, meet with staff. There's a whole bunch of open items after that. To probably directly address Gary's questions. Some of the questions that I have outstanding for staff, one is a really small one, which is HVAC. I think I have one big, you know, softball question. Fleet, I think water, sewer, roads are all just very difficult questions. I'd be interested to hear what Larry's questions are, but they're hard conversations. Culverts, I think, is we need to have a conversation about that, but I think that one should be straightforward. And I think we have to come to some kind of a conclusion on golf. So those are my kind of big topics for. But if we want to get really specific, my thought there is that we kind of do what we did the last time, was that we document our questions. We kind of share them, we clean them up, and then we can go from there. So I think I used up my 15 minutes. That's what I'm thinking.
I have one thought for you, because you were asking a question and basically you were talking about the dollar figures and
Yeah.
Is it enough? Is it too much? Is it whatever? I think the way I kind of look at it is there's a request out there for dollars to do a lot of things. Odds are better than average that there won't be enough money available to do all of those things. So acknowledging that funding is not sufficient to meet the need, anything else that's there would be, from my old world, what would be classified as an accepted risk. We know, you know, like today, right now, whether we consciously accepted the risk or not, we have pretty close to 1,300 culverts that are in need of repair. You know, whether or not that was an eyes open, we don't have the money to do it, therefore we're going to defer it, and it accumulated, or whether it accumulated sort of under the radar as a result of financial decisions, kind of doesn't matter. But where we are right now is we've accepted a risk of that we have a high degree of culverts out there that could potentially fail at any time. A culvert repair replacement program would accelerate the repair from where we are today to some other number, TBD number. That's also accepting a risk. That's accepting that I will not be able to go fix all those culverts tomorrow. That I've got a timeline associated with the repair of those culverts. But at least I can make a better effort going forward. And I think a lot of what we're really looking at doing here with this exercise is trying to understand the dollars that are needed to be able to buy down the most obvious, most significant, risks, so that we don't fail that mission statement you were talking about. I can, to your point, I can have the greatest golf courses in the world, but if I can't get to the golf course because the access road to the golf course collapsed because one of the culverts failed, that doesn't help me that much. So that's kind of the way I would look at it, as a risk acceptance from where's the cut line from a dollar standpoint.
Probably just to somewhat repeat and really support what you're saying. We've been living and increasing with this list for years. We just kind of really didn't have a good idea of what it was. This analysis that we're doing, all the work that everybody's put in. And I can just say, holy moly, there's a lot of really fantastic work in here. At least we have a much better understanding in the old days when we kicked the can down the road, what that means. Now we hopefully will be able to raise funding to take a chunk out of this exhibit. But if that happens, if we're successful, then whatever we're kicking down the road tomorrow will be a whole lot less than what we were kicking down the road yesterday. And we'll have a lot better idea
And we need
of what
to,
we're kicking.
and we need to remember that what we kick is going to get bigger
Oh,
in time.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you listen to Jason at the last board work session, best laid plans can sometimes go astray. From the time they made an exam on one of those large culverts on DeSoto, planned to put a slip liner in it. By the time they got to it, slip liner won't work.
Yep.
Now they're gonna have to do an open trench, concrete, and don't quote me, I'm not to be quoted on the dollar amount, but it's roughly $120,000 more money. And that's only one example of, from the time you plan something until you execute it, if there's too much time, you just dug a deeper hole.
I think most of us, except Karina, probably remember the old Fram oil commercials from back in the day where you had the mechanic holding up the oil filter going, pay me now or pay me later. That's the object example of this kind of scenario. But again, that sort of thing, whether it's a consciously accepted risk or not, it's an accepted risk. And whether we like it or not, a lot of these risks have been accepted. It's our reality today. So all we can really do is try to figure out how to move forward and try to address as many of those things as the dollars will let us go take on.
The high, medium, and low definition, prioritization definition, I believe I believe we need to think of it in terms of the departments. That's all Jason could recommend, is what is either a high priority in his departments or something that they can live without for a while. That's the only way I can look at those priorities. Now, in the Chamber of Commerce, as they say, in that world, the primary POA mission is going to be big. But I believe what we're digging into has to do with the departments. What has not been done in the departments to keep the roads maintained, the culverts maintained, and those kinds of functions. Now, when we get into some of the areas, administration, possibly, maybe lakes, some of those things are gonna pop up in the keeping it attractive, keeping it, an ability to get people's attention, make them feel comfortable. But wait a minute, Gary, you gotta be comfortable driving your car down the road, so how are we gonna move, I just think we need to focus on the departments, on what we're doing. And Jeff, I believe your group will probably be looking at some of that other picture that Tom mentioned. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. To answer that question, yes, I think that's one of the tasks that we have as a future revenue analysis task force is to look at what are the options that we have available to us. And, you know, that will, I guess, piggyback on top of this as to answer some of the questions that Tom was raising, probably not all of them, because I think some of the things that Tom has laid out there also kind of goes to some of that strategic planning and to, you know, track this over time, which gives you something that people can reference back to, which is something I think will be needed going forward, especially if you can't achieve the funding levels that you want. Then it's a way to categorize risk over time. And that's something that I think we could look into after we kind of complete this initial analysis. The other thing I would just like to mention is I think Tom brings up a good point about defining and understanding the priorities. And I think what he laid out there for high is really what we're probably talking about. It's interesting to talk about medium and low, but given the dollar amounts, we know really we only have the time and effort to talk about the high. But I think tied to that is it is running and functioning Hot Springs Village so that the roads aren't deteriorating and we don't fall in a culvert, sinkhole, and those kinds of things are important to just sustaining and maintaining what we enjoy today. I think there's also another piece to that sustain and maintain, which is viable amenities. Doesn't mean you have great amenities, but you have viable amenities, because that's a lot of the reason why people live here, whether it be a trail or the Serenity or golf or pickleball or tennis or, you know, name your whatever. But those have to remain viable, which is where you get the true high priority in the amenities areas would be is only if it's keeps it viable, right? So I think that's something that we might want to consider when we think about that priority when we're looking at areas that are outside of the scope of just roads and culverts and utilities and those kinds of things. And when we look at those, I think we now have a priority list from golf and recreation. So we can look at that from that perspective. And does that keep them viable? If it keeps them viable, then I guess we kind of consider that a need that we proceed forward with. With regards to questions to the staff, the one thing that I think that would be helpful in those big areas, as Larry laid out, and as Tom has laid out, where the big dollars are, is if you get that budget that you say you need, what does that translate to in lay terms? And Tom helped me immensely with streets in just, okay, it allows me to repair potholes and allows me to do certain miles of micro surfacing and this. Okay, so that's better understood than just I need $1 million. without it, a way to translate it and having the experts, as Tom stated, we're not the experts, but the experts can surely help us translate that into an understandable way to define what high priority needs result in and what it translates into what we should expect to see going forward. So that would be one question I think that would be valuable to ask some of the key departments that can help us ensure that that priority scheme makes sense with regards to the way they're describing that. That to me would give us kind of that final sanity check to some of the numbers and the departments list that they've given us so far, which is great that they added that priority stuff so quickly. So that we should be thankful for that. Over.
This is from a simple person's point of view, but with the spreadsheets you're putting together, Larry, isn't there, even the high priority items, some of them are higher priorities than others?
They certainly would be. And I don't know that we are the body that it will end up making that priority call. I think at the end of the day, we'll have a number, you know, borrow Dick's favorite phrase, we'll have the number. We'll be able to take that number and we'll be able to put it into the revenue and expense projection stuff, figure out how much revenue we would need to add to what we currently have to be able to meet the number. And then it becomes really a board decision about how they go about approaching that target. What do they, you know, mix of fees and assessments and other things, you know, all kinds of stuff that goes into that swirl that could get them to a dollar figure.
Yeah.
They'll have to decide how they want to approach that. They'll have to decide what dollar figure they're comfortable approaching. There's no guarantee that they would have the appetite for even what the high priority tasking is. You know, I mean, we're trying to be honest brokers of information, put the numbers in front of them, but then they have to make that decision. At the end of the day, it's not going to operate in execution, in my opinion, a lot differently than the way it does now. The budget's established, it's allocated out by department via the processes that are currently in place. At that point, the budget's allocated to the various directors and department managers, and their task is to go do the best they can with the money they have.
To answer your question a little bit, maybe.
Okay, I was gonna say.
Don't intend to answer your question. I'm assuming that in the world of high priority versus really high priority,
Yes.
when I look at this, I tend to look at it as it doesn't matter whether it's 2022 or 2027. It's just one big fat number.
Yes.
But I think when you come down to budgeting, I'm trusting that if something is really important or super urgent, the department heads are putting that in 2021, 2022, maybe 2023. So the urgent stuff just comes at you a little bit sooner. Having said that, when you look at the high level numbers and where it says high, there's no lump in 22 or 23 or 24. It's pretty dead flat. So when you mush everything together, it's not obvious. But when you get down to the smaller items, you know, maybe there's a reflection of urgency in the timing of the request, but that's a guess.
And I guess, and again, the question may be inappropriate, so I'm totally open to that, but with the spreadsheet you're putting together, isn't there kind of a number that is, this is pretty much the must-haves for right now? That the kicking down the road kicks back if we don't do this. And then another that's the chip away factor, you know, that's,
I
or is
hate
that possible?
to give you the consulting answer, but it depends.
Well, that,
There are those that would argue that the dollars that are being expended right now are sufficient.
Okay, discard that answer.
But I mean, but the point being, you will find people pretty much anywhere on the spectrum. You know, whatever number you pick, there are going to be people who think that's a fair number. There are going to be people who think that's not a fair number. I think the thing I'd like to be able to do when we get to the point of starting to communicate that to the village population and to the board, quite frankly, because most of this stuff will be educational for them as well, is if the organization is asking for a certain amount of dollars, what are the expectations associated with a certain amount of dollars? You know, how many culverts per year am I going to repair? How many miles per year of street maintenance does that buy me? How many miles of road mowing and side and corner clearance does that buy me? So they can, trying to get it out of the dollars where people have variable reactions to it and get down to the, okay, it takes this much money to buy this much product. That means that it will take you, if there's deferral in that area, you can go in and figure out how long until you clear that backlog. You know, and that number could be really short, that number could be really long, it could be very large dollars or not, but give people that kind of framing around the dollars. And then the conversation becomes, okay, so, you know, you're concerned about streets and you'd like to see more dollars in streets. Well, okay, here's an alternative. You know, you can do an extra 10 miles of streets a year, pick a number. There's a dollar figure that comes with 10 miles of streets. That dollar figure translates to so many dollars per month, you know, required to be able to fulfill that obligation. If you're okay with that, great. But then we go down that path, you know, but that's really what it comes down to. And what I think people are being asked for a lot of times is they see a dollar figure, they see a roll up dollar figure, and they struggle to understand what's inside of it, you know. And there's a tendency to remember. We all remember our mistakes a whole lot better than we remember our successes. You know, so there's a tendency of people to remember the mistakes and point fingers backwards, and you know, that's nice, but you know, at the end of the day, what are you really trying to achieve? And trying to get that dialogue out of what happened in the past. Who shot John? You know, as entertaining as it is to figure it out, John's dead in the middle of the living room floor. We got to figure out how to move the body. You know, so how do we move forward from where we are now? And try to put it in terms that folks in the community can understand. And then I would hope, I don't control this, but I would hope that going forward, that kind of community communication would carry on, you know, and say, okay, we had an unexpected event happen. We had to divert money from other places and go deal with this unexpected event. What did that mean? That meant I lost 40 culverts this year. I lost 5 miles of streets this year, whatever that might happen to be, because something bad happened and I had to go fix it.
In my,
Kathy, if I could just add on to that though, to kind of to your pointed question, if you look at the way that these different departments put their money in by year, and when we first started reviewing with them, they basically told us that, hey, the most urgent of the urgent are the ones that I put in the near years, and those things that I think I can squeak out a little bit longer, I put in later in the year. But the point I think really is that if you take those near-term urgent numbers, it's still a number per year, you know, going across there. And for the most part, it's a slightly increasing number, but it is still a number per year that they need to kind of keep knocking down most urgent of the urgent from year to year as they go along. Does that make sense?
It does, and one of the things I've sort of inferred as we listened, in a perfect world, we know what the backlog is, but using the term backlog with a list also infers that somebody had a plan to begin with. And what we have, I believe, as you said, is putting out fires. The culvert situation is pretty close to a plan. I mean, the departments have come up with a list, bad to medium to. But as far as how many miles of road do we replace or resurface? What they've been able to do is basically as you patch as needed. And I keep coming back to that. So that's not an answer. That's just a thought that I just keep coming back to.
Yeah.
And in a perfect world, high priority means in Jason's definition is we have to have that. And we need to be able to trust that they have put this together that way.
And I guess, again, I'm trying to simplify this, so you guys may not understand it at all, but from a selling or an actual number perspective, because there is no number. I trust the staff, because they've done it for years, to prioritize the dollars that are there. And what we're being tasked with is to come up with a number that will get us moving slightly forward. I mean, the PPE funds, is that what they are, the 3.3 million or whatever?
The PPP.
We haven't heard anything on that yet, have we? That's scary.
They're
But-
behind. I've
Okay,
been bugging them a lot.
okay. Squeaky wheels, good job. But that gives us a little boost for some totally urgent tasks. But if it's easy for me to justify with some of the data that I do see, that there's a number that we need each year that will be, and I'm not throwing a number out there, but somewhere between, in all probability, 4 and 5 million extra a year that we need. Is it going to solve all the high priority problems? Absolutely not. We have to trust the staff to do an accepted risk, but something that's going to keep things from totally falling down, because that is, from what I've seen, a viable possibility. You know, we've got a sludge pond that they could say it doesn't meet criteria. I don't know what happens then. They close it down, I guess. We've got roads and culverts that if we don't fix them, they're going to cost us more in the future. So it seems like that number, is that in your spreadsheets kind of, or is it an average of?
Well, so
How does that
right
work?
now, what I would, if I were showing the board today, I'll put it that way. If all the O&M tables were, we had a bow tied around and we all said, you know, good enough. I would show the board the current revenue. I would show the board the current expenses, propagate that forward. The board, we already have the operating expenses from salaries. And again, assuming the tables were updated and all that with salaries and whatnot. We'd have that, we'd have the capital expenditure expectations. And so there would be, there'd probably be a cost bar, there'd probably be a cost line, and then there'd probably be like 3 areas in the background on that chart. One of them would be high priority, one would be medium priority, high plus medium, one would be high plus medium plus low. You know, with the recommendations being that they would try to target to fund what's classified as high priority. You know, that would hopefully allow you to start to catch up across the board on all of that stuff that hasn't been done for reasons many and various over time. I don't think, but again, it would be up to the board at that point where they, basically they need to decide where they want to set that income line and what they want that to look like. And then we have to help them understand numerically what they need to do to get there. But, that would be my recommendation would clearly be that you fund the high priority stuff, recognizing that you're going to leave some stuff behind. You're either going to slow your rate of progress against certain things, or you're going to continue to defer certain things, or some combination of those. But you do it eyes open. You know what you're deferring. It's not just pure reaction at that point. You're looking at it, and then the other thing that I would hope would happen going forward is that we don't pour concrete around the 7-year operations and maintenance budget, put a plaque in the pavement in front of it, and look at it 7 years later. It needs to be a tool that everybody works with, that the staff works with, that the board works with going forward. Because the one thing that will be absolutely certain in any of these projections that we're making is they'll absolutely be wrong. They might be wrong good, they might be wrong bad, but they're going to be wrong. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to do a checkpoint at the end of every year. There's the budgeting cycle for the next year, and then once we get past that budgeting cycle, then we have to take whatever lessons we learned that year and pay them forward into the operations and maintenance tables, add the next year to operations and maintenance, and keep this whole thing moving forward. And again, it's an eyes open conversation. We can look at it and say, well, we thought we could do X amount of culverts per year, and it turns out we only did 80% of X culverts per year. Well, okay, if that's going to be the long-term future going forward, then we have to decide, is that good enough or not? If it's good enough or not, you change your timeline projection and move on. If it's not, then you decide what you're going to do to be able to recover.
Gary, if I could.
Yes.
Yeah, Gary. So it sounds to me like we still have a few questions left for the staff that we could probably put together like we've done before, and through Karina can get them to the staff and then get them answered, and maybe ask a few questions to clarify those in the next upcoming meeting that we have. Sounds like we're down to just a few areas. The second piece sounds like we need to take a look at what we received from Karina there with regards to recreation and golf, and make sure that there aren't any outstanding questions in those areas. Which again, if we do have questions, we could provide questions back to the staff and follow up with their department heads for any of that kind of stuff. Sounds like with Tom's help there, we've kind of gotten ourselves to an idea what the definition that of high priority and what I'll call the need is, and we can look at what that looks like in a forecast across the 7. And I always put a 7+ because even the staff knows that it's beyond 7. So there's stuff beyond 7, but we're looking at 7. So it's 7+ years. That starts to create the number that Larry was talking about, and the numbers of high, medium, and low that add up to a number, which gives us a projection of what that cost and gets us to really to answer Dick's question, which is kind of our task, which is, okay, so probably the high priority number is the number that we need to do, and what's that look like over time, right? So it's 60 million, but it's not 60 million each year. It's, total 60 million. So what's that look like over time compared to that? And then if we can explain what that then translates into achieving in miles of street, number of culverts repaired, roofs and paint and those kinds of things, then I think that gets us to a point where we should be able to write a report that tells the board kind of that summary. Over.
makes sense. Unless, does anybody else have anything we should mix together today, or do you want to go back and look at the new?
I'd like to talk through the questions I've got and get other people's thoughts on questions, because Tom made a couple statements when he was talking that made me write down notes because things I hadn't thought of. So I think if we're really probably gonna get one more whack at the staff.
Yeah.
And then we gotta draw this to a close and move on. So I don't wanna them to come out of, dribs and drabs. I'd like to try to put together a comment list.
Okay, make a couple of statements. I agree with you, one last shot. The only question in my mind is, are we shooting for next Monday or 2 weeks from today? That's the only question with respect to talking about this.
I think we talked about 2 weeks from today.
I think it depends on how fast we can get that information to them. We're not asking them a lot of, I don't think we're asking them 100 questions. I'm hoping, my hope would be we could get them data like COB tomorrow, so give them time to react to it and do it next week. But I might stand corrected.
I think next week is possible. 2 weeks from today is far more comfortable. I think, I agree with Larry, it's not a ton of questions. I'm just not sure that we as a group know what those questions are.
Well,
So whether we can,
why don't we try to generate the question list,
Yeah.
and then once we get an idea of how many there are, maybe that'll drive the answer.
right.
So,
And if I could just throw one other thing is that if we might find a middle ground where we just meet Wednesday of next week instead of Monday, which gives them a few more days over.
Okay, that's.
We
That
can
would
beef
work,
up.
that would work as well, as long as they have availability.
think
I like
I'm good
that
with
idea.
Wednesday next week.
Personally, I'd prefer to see closure sooner rather than later, because this information then gets handed over to the future revenue task force, and we got some grinding we have to do on that side as well.
Do we have to nail that down now or?
Now, let's decide after.
How does
So
your
I,
Wednesday shape up?
so I had a few.
Yeah, I'm good next.
You're both,
We're talking about down to a few questions.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
say few.
Pardon?
10, 15.
10, 15, 18.
But some of them should be pretty, I mean, some of my questions are real straightforward. I don't need to talk to anybody. I just would like to know what the answer are. But some of them might be kind of down and dirty, but one way or the other, I think they all involve Jason and his staff.
And his staff. For the most part, I agree with you. I mean, I had, for example, I had specific item in common property and forestry, we had the road mowing contract. It's still showing, if I did the math right, like 680 miles of road mowing over the next 7 years. So my question would be, what does that burn rate look like if you make that a 10-year timeline instead of a 7-year timeline, for example? You know, that means you're not doing as much mowing, you know, particularly in the later years. Right now, there's a fairly steady climb on that. You know, do we climb it to a certain point, plateau it, and let it run out 10, 11 years? You know, and we know the recommended number is 680 miles. You know, can we spread that 680 miles of road mowing over 10 years or 11 years? Let the folks who have the expertise weigh in on that and see if there's some way that reduces our burn rate. That's a comparatively small dollar item, but it's, you know, if you knock off 50 or 75K a year.
Can I put a note on that?
Sure.
Just, your vegetation grows rapidly. I mean, and most of your companies that come in, like, for example, West Tree that subcontracts for energy getting the power lines, so it's all the vegetation cutting and stuff.
Mhm.
They're typically 5 to 7 years. When they've come back to a place by the 7th year, it's completely overgrown. And that may be the same issue with all of your mowing and your
Mhm.
right of ways and
Mhm.
stuff. So
Mhm.
just something to keep in mind, if that's something you're asking, you're gonna have maybe people on the outskirts that can't see across the street or whatever. So
Sure.
extending
And-
that, you're gonna have.
Yeah, 7-year-old pine
Issues.
tree is a pretty good sized tree, and that's what Triple is gonna refill. No, point taken, and I think that's really, again, we don't know what we don't know. I know that there are streets out there, but I don't know how many miles of them there are where there's no homes.
Gotcha.
You know, for example, those things, I'm sure they're significantly overgrown at this point. Everything's probably right up against the road right now. I don't know how many miles of that there are, so I don't know, you know, are those things that could potentially be deferred out, continue to be deferred out because we're not likely to be doing any development in there. in the
We look
foreseeable
at our
future.
active
Yeah,
usable roads at this point in
Exactly.
time. What's that mileage versus the 680 total miles?
yeah,
And spread that out over your 7 years.
exactly. That kind of a thought process, you know, for example. So that was one specific
Can
one.
we go back to that? In my head, and I could be wrong, because I'm, this is not, certainly not my area of expertise. We've been mowing the sides of roads for years and years and years. To some degree, they're talking about more like roadside trimming, which would be overhang and line of sight. Were you talking about one versus the other, or both, or?
I think it's both. I think
Okay,
it's both. I
Right.
think it's a combined activity. Now, that may be me being not so
I
bright.
think there's different lines in the budget,
Mhm.
and one of them is in the capital line, and that's the one I said, well, I don't think you can capitalize that. But regardless, it's, you know, whether it's in capital or operating.
Yeah.
You still have to pay for it because we don't do it because we don't have the equipment. to
Well,
mow it.
you actually did raise another thing that I observed, and I did see there's in the streets expenses, there's something for site clearance and tree removal.
Right.
And then in the streets capital, there's the road mowing, tree removal and site view clearance.
Right, and then there's
So-
another one that says inventory, and I think when they were talking about doing an inventory, I thought maybe that's where they do that LiDAR survey. Because I think that's like totally important, just my opinion.
Yeah.
Having said that, I kind of think that you pretty much need to mow, just take a mower and mow weeds,
Mhm.
like on every road there is.
Mhm.
But when you're talking about overhang and line of sight, it's not clear to me that you need to do every mile of road, or whether you only need to do half or 3/4 or 1/3 without doing the LiDAR survey.
Well, I think another part of that whole where do you choose to send the crew is you come up to a street corner, you know, and if you can't see
Right.
the road, you know, if you can't see the road clearly to be able to know whether or not it's safe to make a turn and it's a heavily traveled road, well, clearly that's something you want to clear the spacing back.
Right.
But
Yes.
there are other streets in various areas of the community. I said there's 0 properties out there. There's no near-term expectation. There's going to be a property out there anytime soon. Well, okay, that's something you're not going to send the crew there. You're going to send them in other places. And again, we let the folks that are responsible for allocating the resources that they get go figure out how to best use them.
Right.
But that, like I said, that was one specific one. My favorite child, culverts. The implied amount of culverts that would be contracted out to be re-sleeved with the number that's out there for 7 years, which is like 1.65 mil. It's like 253 culverts, you know, just rounding the number.
Ooh, okay. Was it Ron sent out a spreadsheet
Yeah,
with every last culvert with his estimate?
Okay.
I'm not sure that I would take his numbers super seriously, but it's like a million times better than us sitting around.
Oh, I don't disagree. So
So we need to take a look at that.
This is just me being behind the curve
Yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
emails this morning.
I
I
understand.
only printed the first list. I didn't print list 2 because it was way longer.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
it's all, it's,
It would.
each
it went
and
to that-
every
it went to the
1100
category 2 culverts.
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah,
But you're looking at the 3.3 on your level 1.
right.
Okay.
Don't tell him what's left.
Yeah, well, but the other, so that's a 2-part question. First part of that is, are we really going to contract out 250 some odd culverts to be re-sleeved? because they
Yeah,
run,
yeah.
they're,
Well, generally you want to save, based on whatever the heck we know, in 2 years from now, we're gonna know a whole lot more. What's the proportion of a general contractor versus in-house?
well, the second part of that was if I understood the math on this, and I'm not sure that I do, but if I understood the math, last year, we did roughly, the single street crew did something around between 20 and 20, has capability to do between 20 and 25 culverts a year in addition to all the other stuff they do. You know, so in the budget, there's the addition of a second street crew. Okay, that makes sense. Assumedly, the total labor pool can be dedicated to go do more culverts, you know, so you probably get your culvert program up to about 75 or 80 culverts a year, you know, maybe 70, 75, pick whatever number you're comfortable with. Okay, we got 1,300 culverts. That says we got about an 18-year recovery timeline. That's better than now, which the current recovery timeline's infinity, because they're failing faster, you can fix them. So that's good. It's not great, but it's good. That may be all we could afford. But when I see there's lines in there that cover like costs to go do materials for culverts and things like that. Okay, it makes sense that if you add the street crew, you add the dollars associated with the material they need to go do their job. But if that street crew is basically going to be flatlined for the full period, the material dollars continue to escalate. So it's just one of those things of, you know, and the other part of that, back to that quantification, is okay, if it's 2 street crews, if you got a capacity of approximately this number of culverts a year, that's the reality that we live in today. You know, that recovery timeline is whatever the recovery timeline is. And plus whatever we feel like, you know, you can give the outside contractors to do that sort of work. And that tells you where your timeline is, that tells you what your risk posture is.
Mhm.
You know, so
Yeah.
having that quantification would be useful.
Yes.
So the other one I had was in street maintenance, and I know from some legacy conversations and a recent board discussion, Ron's target for streets is 30 miles a year. You know, courtesy of Tom going into his email and sending some stuff out from before Jeff and I got aboard. There's a pretty nice distribution for nominally how that 30 miles a year would probably be expended. You know, about 50% of it in crack filling, about 40% of it doing what they call microsurfacing and asphalt overlays on about 3 miles of it. That translates to something like 1.2 miles a year. Or excuse me, no, sorry, 2 miles, 1.2 million a year
Yeah.
to be able
Something
to
like
go.
6 miles.
Yeah, to be able to go do that. If you step it up in 22 and then you step it up to the full 30 miles of road starting in 23, which is kind of what's looking like it's in their budget. If you flatlined it at that point, that expenditure would be around $7 million a year. The current model is showing like $8.2 million because it's kind of an ever increasing curve. You know, so again, that's one of those questions. If you could get back to 30 miles of streets a year, is that sufficient?
Mhm.
You know, from a high priority standpoint, is that sufficient? You know, and then you can always put an extra 10 miles of streets out there in medium priority on the odd miracle that the POA wins the lottery or some other significant revenue source is forthcoming. You know, maybe they finally find out who owns NRP and can get the judgment paid. But, you know, things like that, you know, would be valuable. Said in culvert repair, there was a staff line. Again, there was a staff line that looked like it was tied to the culvert replacement program, but the staff wasn't moving, but the replacement expenses were. So it's like, if those line up, that would be good. I had a couple things in lakes. One of them is going to sound completely incongruous based on where my previous questions were. Right now in lakes, there's nothing that's high priority. But there are some line items in lakes that are medium priority that are repair existing infrastructure. Those actually feel like those need to go to high priority. Because otherwise you're probably never gonna get the budget to go to, you know, so any of those where it's a repair something, I think it really needs, there's 4 or 5 items in that budget probably really need to be moved up to high priority to be completely fair. No real commentary on lakes relative to dredging except this. Not for this exercise, but at some point down the road, probably need to have a conversation and understand just how frequently that dredging exercise needs to take place. I mean, I live on Lake Renata. They dredged the lake last year. And it was my understanding that it was the first time the lake had been dredged in 18 years. Well, clearly 18 years in the timeline in all likelihood, but
It's a 7-year rotation. that
Yeah.
They've set up for the lake dredging.
yeah, so the question is it 7 years because that's because you're dredging 7 lakes? Is there something behind that? Because for example, if you said, if you changed it from a 7-year increment to a 9-year increment or something like that, then your expenses associated with the dredging will stretch out over time. And I don't know the answer. I mean, that's just more of a thought exercise. And I don't think that's something that needs to be done associated with this activity right now. But it's one of those things that we probably need. There are probably people out there who know that answer off the top of their heads and can educate the rest of us. But
A, that would be Brad. B, I believe he mentioned that once you dredge out a place, right now the muck is like this, and you dredge it down to here.
Mhm.
There should be a standard that says when it gets up to here, you should think about it, A. B, when you dredge it, if it's this deep and you dredge it, it'll probably be cheaper than if you dredge it when it's like that.
It is,
True.
they're charging a big part of the cost is for how much garbage they're pulling out. It's-
Right.
have to dispose
by
of all the
quantity.
debris. Yeah,
So,
have to dispose
if you're
of all the
lucky-
debris.
It's muck. If you're unlucky, it's old water heaters and tires.
So if we
Oh,
if
surely
we
not.
keep that within a lower time frame, your costs are going to go down and be maintained at that lower level.
Mhm.
Which is why it's been so high going through all of these lakes the first time, because I mean, they were hauling an unbelievable amount out.
God knows what.
So it was astronomical expenses. So
Mhm.
part of trying to balance that is to keep those costs
Okay,
on the lower level.
okay. Like I said, maybe that's
The
just,
answer to your 7 or 10 years though, that'd be Brad.
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I don't know, I don't know what the answer to that is, and I don't think that's necessarily a question to pass forward, but that was one
Well,
curiosity I
I mean, I
saw.
think to me, it's somewhat relevant because in my mind, and I wanted to beat this dead horse one more time. So I'd like an opportunity to restate it. You can argue all day long whether dredging is high, medium, or low. Right now, it's stated as part of operating, so it isn't not eligible for high, medium, and low. But assuming that we've never dredged our lakes like in 40, 50 years or whatever, yeah, we probably really need to dredge it in the 7-year time frame that we're thinking of. And here's my question for this group, because I've been trying to listen real hard to what you're going to say. Walking into this room and looking at the definition that we've been supplied with, our mission statement, and just the, general chit chat. When I walked in this room, I kind of was having either a thought or a outcome that says, fixing roads high is this, fixing amenities, same level, high means the same. And from Gary's statement, if you're going to look at it at a department level, high means high. But I've heard some talk here that maybe amenities should be like this. And, roads and infrastructure should be like this. The point I was making, if you read the mission statement, you almost come out with amenities is like this and infrastructure is like that. So I guess the question for this group and for me, and I'm not sure how this changes how I look at things, where are those, two hand puppets? Is one hand puppet higher than the other? Or should they be, about the same? I don't have a really good answer to that. But when it comes, I think lake dredging is an example. My other favorite is bunker renewal. If you're gonna emphasize roads, then bunkers are like that. That's my opinion. But I'm trying to get it to rationalize to say bunkers should be like that because there are a lot of people who want bunkers to be done.
And criticize the golf program because of it.
Well, the golf program has no end to criticism.
What about the condition of the bunker?
I'm just looking at bunkers.
Well, I think you bring up an important point through all of this is it's a balancing act.
Yes.
And regardless of the past, whether we emphasized on recreation and amenities more than we should have and kicked the can down the road too much for infrastructure or vice versa, it comes back to, we can't forget about one sector because we're focusing on the other. Because otherwise, that's all the can we've kicked down the road, and we're going to be doing this in the reverse cycle on 7 years from now. So I agree with you. It's a balancing act.
Jeff, did you have something?
I was just going to repeat, that's why I stated that. I mean, we have maintain and sustain our infrastructure, yes, and viable amenities, because both matter to property owners, right? So that's where the balancing act has to occur. And as Karina said, you can't trade one for the other. I mean, you have to kind of do both and do both in kind of a balancing act where your amenities stay viable, so people are happy and enjoying the Hot Springs Village, and yet you're maintaining sustaining infrastructure so that you can drive down the roads without going boom, boom, boom. So I think that's an important piece. One other quick comment here, Gary, is since Larry was going through questions, I said I already kind of stated what I think our question to some of the departments is mainly in roads and those, which is, tell me how that's explained in some kind of lay term, miles of road, things like that, that can kind of be translated into some kind of plan. It's easier to talk to property owners when you talk to them in those terms. So to me, that's a question for the staff to try and kind of round out for us the priority piece there. And then Gary, unfortunately, I'm going to end up dropping off here in the next minute or two. So I trust whatever else you guys are going to come up with, and I'll pay close attention to emails, make sure any other questions or stuff like that I get added to the mix as quickly as possible so we can get back to the staff with what we need to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for taking the time. I know you're in a working mode. We'll see you when you're back.
Take care, Jeff. So I had a couple of other generic questions kind of along that same line. We have a meeting to ask and we never did ask. I think we need to ask the street folks and the water and sewer folks fundamentally the same question. And that is, at what population level will we have to expand our current infrastructure?
And
Add water, add sewage capacity, rebuild the West Gate, start looking at intersection improvements, things like that. I don't know that anybody can sit here and say in 2024, I'm going to have to go expend dollars to go do this. But I think a lot of those things are tied to, volume and usage, and that's predominantly humans. You know, how many cars are on the road, how many taps are hitting the water system, how many toilets are hitting the waste system, things like that.
And that isn't something we necessarily need to budget for, at least in my mind. It would be more maybe a suggestion on rebuilding the reserves or building the reserve structure up to compensate when that occurs.
That would be my thought.
Because they've kind of said with water, we're pretty good for quite a
Point is knowing that those things are out there, knowing that they're gonna show up. They're not forget about it, because you know they're real, they're gonna happen eventually. But trying to put together some kind of a threshold that says, okay, I'll make up a number that says when I get to 20,000 people, I've got to add water capacity. You know, well, okay, if 20,000 people is the magic number, then when I get to about 80 population, where we're currently at ballpark 15, you know, if I get to about 18.5, then I probably better start doing some serious planning about what it's going to take to add to the water system, because that gives me that 2 or 3 or 4 years of planning horizon that I need to be able to go figure out how I'm going to make that happen. Make sure I've got reserve funds in place, make sure I'm properly prepared. Maybe I have a bond issue option or something, you know, what I basically have to understand that I've got that expenditure coming, and how am I going for it? And if I don't, how am I going to make sure that I'm properly positioned when that occurs? You know, the reserve funds that we currently have should be sufficient to cover any of the, you know, what I call the oh crap moments that you can reasonably foresee right now.
I don't know, I look at what's for wastewater and think one sludge pond failure could wipe that out overnight, if what I think I see is correct.
Mhm.
But you're so good with spreadsheets, Larry. Is it possible to build something? Because as population comes in, there's obviously income from them.
Mhm.
I don't know what you're using for that.
Mhm.
I've seen various numbers bandied about, but would it be possible for this hallowed group, for the ones who are knowledgeable, to put together something that says for every 3,000, 20,000 is hard to conceive of when we're
Mhm.
13 now, but for every, we'll say 2,000 of growth, or every 1,000 home sites, we need to increase reserves X amount for this, that, or the other thing? Would that be a guideline within our recommendations or not?
I guess it'd be possible. I wasn't looking at it in terms of reserves, but you could probably do that.
Maybe
Or
just
you could,
guidelines.
yeah, or you could
I look at-
identify some criteria associated with
Yeah.
it. You know, I mean, you know, I think the reality of it is the more population growth you have, the more demands you're going to place on certain aspects of the infrastructure. So you'd want to make sure you're prepared for it. But that said, we're not adding, for good or ill, we're not adding 1,000 people a year to the community or anything like that. I mean, if you actually go look at I actually went and looked at the population history of the village, and we're surprisingly stable. You know, we add, like right now, we're doing a lot of building, there's a lot of new home building, there's very few empty properties because real estate market's very hot. We're probably accelerating the population by 250 to 300 people a year, just ballpark figure. You know, but if you put a setback in there that said when you got within 1,200 or 1,500 people of your
Yeah, that might be
demand
it.
signal, you know, then that still gives you 3-4 years of 5 years of planning horizon. So it's not like it's, you know, trying to avoid the bridge abutment, hitting the bridge abutment at a high rate of speed, but at least you can now see that there's a bridge out there, so you try not to steer toward it.
Given past history, I'd just like some guidelines, because we may not have a Tom, a Larry, and a Jeff. 7
Well,
years from now to
hopefully-
study this and,
Hopefully you got people better than we are doing it, but
well, but the
You
board
should,
changes
whether they
every
volunteer
year.
or not, another issue.
it's never with those volunteer on social media. So I had a question related to sanitation. It's not something for short term, but it was related to the water meter replacement. It feels like, and I know that's still kind of in churn, you know, that feels like something that may be a better news story than maybe it looks like right now. It just feels like maybe there's an opportunity there for being able, you know, this might be another side of the garbage truck kind of a story. But I don't know
Leverage
yet.
technology,
Sir?
leverage technology.
Yeah, you know, I mean, if you don't have to, you know, if you take into account the touch labor of people who don't have to go out and physically read water meters, they can do a drive-by and get it. They get their job done a lot faster. That frees them up to do other things, plus the more accurate readings and better revenue from the water system and all that. So there's a lot of pieces of that. And this is really one of Jeff's points, the line items that are related to I&I manhole line replacement. That's one of those places where we really need to understand what that dollar figure buys. You know, I
Or
mean,
even what the risks are. I still
Yeah.
not sure what the risks are, but
Yeah.
it sounded bad.
yeah. Yeah, anecdotally, it makes perfect sense, but we can't look at somebody and say, okay, last year those dollars bought X hundred feet, X thousand feet. I don't even know what the scale is on this thing, but we need something around that helps us understand what that looks like. This is a quick check question for the guys. I know we charge for the Simplex pumps, that shows as income. And then there's a corresponding line item that is the cost.
They just go in and in.
I was wondering if that was really what the cost of the pump was, or if if basically we're just passing through
Yeah.
what our cost is.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one question we don't have to ask then. One of them, and I think it was, I don't remember where it was. It might have been in Fleet. There was something called a Moorbark wood chipper grinder that was listed at 600K.
Was that a low priority?
I don't remember. I don't remember what priority it was, to be honest with you. It might have been because it was a little further down the list than some of the others. I was just wondering if that was a typo or not. If it was really 600, if it was really 60K, because that seemed like a heck of a lot of money for a wood chipper.
Well,
Which department was that?
Oh, I knew you were
It's
gonna
in
ask.
Fleet.
I'll look it up.
Didn't you say it was in Fleet?
I think it was in Fleet, but I might be wrong.
Oh,
Yes,
most of-
a brush brand. Yes.
It's called a Moorbark wood chipper.
we'll ask on the dollar amount, but that's because they're eventually hoping to do like the recycled materials, sell into mulch and compost and those sorts of things. So I would say it should be low.
I don't see it. I'll look for it here in a minute, try to find it again, because I don't know where that is. Don't remember. Another one I had, which was, it was in the streets area. Again, it was more to Jeff's questions related to how much am I actually buying. There was guardrail work and there was parking lot sealing.
Signs.
And it was both of those things tended to have sort of a steady state increasing curve. Don't really know what that buys, you know, so it'd be nice to understand what that buys and what that increment actually pays for. In streets, I did find the reference for site clearance and tree removal. Don't have any idea if that's a dupe of the common property and forestry entry or not, but it looks like it might be. But I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. And that was the last of my questions, but I did make a note about your comment about HVAC, because that was a very good point.
Well, what was your question about the HVAC?
Well, I think they're medium priority and every year you budgeted, say, 50,000. I don't remember what the number is. So it looked to me like it's anticipatory. It's probably been happening for a while. 1 year it might be 1 and the next year it might be 3. A lot of it was, a primary motivation is the coolant is like the stuff
The
that
R-22s.
yeah, it kills birds as they fly by, stuff like that. The problem I have with medium, with high, I would look at that and say, chances are when we're done, a high percentage of that is going to go through. The mediums, I'm not too sure about. I tend to look at stuff like that and say, is it a 10% haircut? Is it a 20% haircut? When I look at stuff like HVAC, it's like medium.
Well, let's
I
ask
mean,
about it.
when you need to replace an HVAC unit, especially if it's leaking the old stuff, I think you have to replace it. And I think you have to replace it like right now. I mean, if you have a maintenance guy who looks at it and said, I don't like the looks of that dude, it's time you replace it. So when I look at that, I say, maybe I can give it a haircut, but I'm not going to give it a 40% haircut. I might give it a 10% haircut. So stuff like that. And I had the same relative question with fleet. When I look at fleet, 3.7 million is high and 5.6 million is medium. My guess is we're going to need most of that 5.6 million. I mean, whether it's 2023 or 2024 or 2025, those things are indeed getting older every year. And it might look like a medium today, but when you get there, or a year past that, or a year past that, it's going to go only in one direction. It's going to get, higher and higher. Your only hope is there's stuff in there that you just simply don't need.
Well, I think that kind of comes back, well, I'll answer this in 2 parts. On the HVAC, I think we would need to go back to Mike and ask why he put medium versus high. And my first assumption would be is for the last couple of years, they've been doing an HVAC replacement program.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the HVACs have been being replaced. So it could be that they're all in the first few years of their life, and that's maybe why it's medium at this point, but I need to confirm that.
Mm-hmm.
The second part of all of that is like your example with fleet, which also comes back to an example with the HVAC and every other thing in here almost is, are we looking at it at today's point in time to classify it as high, medium, and low? Or are we trying to encompass over 7 years? Because everything that's on our medium stuff, not everything, a good chunk of what's on your medium stuff is gonna be high by the time we get to where it's at in that time frame.
Right.
That's what that's the way I was interpreting some of these items. Today, it's workable, but I know from experience,
Exactly.
it's not
7
going.
years, just 7 years from now.
And I think that's the approach that most of them took. It's okay,
Yeah.
for the couple years we can get by, but within the 3-year frame, we need it. So that's where it came into medium.
But my mindset is, again, to look at those numbers and say, are we going to give that a haircut? And is it going to be a big haircut or a small haircut? So that's the issue that I'm wrestling with. I think we have to ask some questions to give ourselves a better understanding about, that process.
And I think part of all this is when we're only comparing it with the current year.
Yeah.
And forward, the current year took a huge cut.
Yeah.
And so when you're not looking at the last 10 years to see, okay, we were spending this, then we've seen it dwindle down to only 10%. We're kind of seeing the effect of it, but we're not seeing that drastic change. So I think in my mind, my opinion, I should say, if you're not careful, it can skew what you're looking at. Because you may be looking at 21 like that's been our basis all along.
You actually raise a very good point there. One of the things I was going to ask you for on behalf of the future revenue task force is if we had any of that historical data about what our expenditures were over the preceding years. Because to your point, I suspect what you see is there used to be a certain level of expenditure, whatever it was, and I suspect that it probably has a dip in it, and I don't know if we're at the bottom of the dip or we've come past the bottom of the dip and are starting to climb out or not.
We're
It
in
would
the
be-
bottom of the dip.
Yeah, it would be good to understand what that is, so that that tends to buttress the position that says, look, you've got multiple millions of dollars of maintenance need to be taken care of in all these various areas, well, why is that here? Well, let's see this big bathtub right here, well, it's the bathtub empty.
Well, I mean, streets is just a good example of that. They used to have the over $500,000 at minimum,
Mhm.
in each of these or some of these lines for maintenance and capital improvements.
Mhm.
500,000 minimum compared to 150, you can tell that's chump change.
Mhm.
I mean, that's
It's-
just keeping
it's-
that in perspective.
Yeah, it's comparatively small dollar, but it has a huge impact on the ability of the street department to keep the roads maintained. And I mean, if you don't have the money to touch them, then you're not gonna be able to do anything with
I mean, granted, yeah, 150,000 is still a lot of money,
But compared to what the need is,
exactly.
for what it's worth, your Morbark is line item 144, and it is listed as medium.
it. Yeah, I saw
In
it. It
2026.
is in fleet. It's way out there in time, but it is in fleet. That was just a number that struck me.
What year was it in? 2026?
Okay. And it was 600,000?
600K.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, there was another one in fleet that I inadvertently skipped, and I'm not sure if this is duplicate entry or not, it might be. There's a couple line items out in fleet capital for something called a Peterbilt 337 with Challenger body, and it says for sanitation. So I'm wondering if that's a recap, if that was the historical recapitalization of the purchase of the garbage trucks.
Probably the one we already have,
That's
not the
my-
new ones.
That would be my guess.
Because those are, I think, Peterbilt 337s are.
So it's
So-
planned replacement. No, wrong line.
But now there is one that they're keeping, which is
Yeah.
gonna be their backup. So I'm not sure if maybe it's that one.
I actually think there were 3 line items in fleet for that, so it kind of felt to me like it was probably tied to the current trash truck count, but I wasn't sure if that was
Oh, well, and he's got
an erroneous entry or just catching up on the next slide.
comment that came back. The original plan with sanitation trucks was to replace all rear load trucks, and now sanitation is wanting to keep a backup truck for the plant mini rear loader. This was left blank while we came up with a definite plan of action. I've updated the O&M as if we were keeping this truck and added a scheduled replacement.
Okay,
And that was what came out today.
okay. So, and I'm not current on today's email. I was tied up with other stuff today, so that may have self-solved.
So
Other questions? You got other questions to?
you're doing,
Well, I do, but I'm not nearly as well prepared as you, so I'd have to go home and work on it.
yeah, so
What happens when you wake up too early and have a couple of cups of coffee early in the morning?
is that what happens to you?
That's kind of what happened this morning.
It's only happened to me once this year. So you're going to originate list of questions
I
and then
can.
Tom
I can.
can probably add to it. And we're not forgetting Kathy. Kathy writes a lot, but we don't always get to see it.
Well, Kathy her question would be, these minutes are going to be difficult to summarize, obviously. From a discussion standpoint, I'm anticipating including your handout
If you wish.
as an attachment, or is that necessary? And I was thinking of,
I don't think it's necessary, but
okay, then I'll write a very brief summary of it.
Yeah,
Again,
the other
it's-
one that was there that was kind of our working dialogue back and forth, I think probably should stay
Yeah.
working dialogue back.
Yes,
and
the
forth.
orange and blue.
Yeah,
I'll just
Yeah.
say a list of questions was circulated.
yeah, it was really there. It was really there more to try to
People
Tom did a
thinking.
great job of starting the conversation, saying, hey, here are the things we need to think about. And then Jeff and I had to put our quarter in the slot.
my goal is to keep today under 4 hours.
I think we're gonna do
I
Very
think you're
brief.
gonna
summary.
achieve it.
There's a lot of ways to do that.
Well,
Okay,
So Lori's
so
gonna
we'll-
prepare a list of questions.
get those questions.
yeah, I'll send out a draft. I'll try to get that out to COB today. I'm not gonna make any promises because I've been home since 7:30 this morning, so I don't know what's going on at the house.
Yeah,
Can we go out and get you another cup of coffee?
A little late for that. Well, then it would get.
We don't
done-
care.
Well, then it would get done COB, but it closed about 1 in the morning because if I have caffeine this time of day, I'll be staring at the ceiling until 1 AM.
okay, so we'll get those
I'm still drinking coffee.
to Karina as soon as
You're
possible.
young.
And depending on that time, we can decide if staff needs more time than Monday to answer those. My interpretation is that most of these could be answered pretty straightforward.
I think most of the stuff should be straightforward. The only things that may prove a little bit more difficult is trying to get the quantitative measures for some of this stuff. I mean, when I sent out the email with the questions, I provided an example. And it was, if we're spending $50,000 on streets right now, and that gets us 5 miles, and if we spend 150, that gets us this, out of this many miles, that's a 10-year replacement.
Mhm.
So I forwarded you guys kind of what I got back. I mean, I think it helps a little bit, but I think there's still some questions that you guys are gonna have regarding it all. And it's not just that, that's just an example, but other than that, they should be pretty straightforward and easy to answer for them.
Yeah, they're high, medium, and low in, I don't want to spend any time on this, but streets, they want to put a fence around a couple places, Menorca Yard and the gravel pit. I don't know if we're experiencing loss, but it's called High Road. You know, there's all sorts.
Menorca's had, which is where streets is, in the last several months, they've had, I can tell you, 2 break-ins off the top of my head, just since the first of the year.
Okay,
So they are putting security cameras in over there, and that's probably part of why they want the fence up, is to try to keep some of that deterred.
okay, well,
The
that,
gravel pit is where Jason is hoping to expand, to move common property over there, and the streets crew that he's gonna move over there. And that's also where they do a lot of their dumping and stuff. And so just to make sure that they're monitoring that site and all that, so that's.
okay, that's just an example for me that there was thought put into the high, medium, and low priority. Obviously, part of that gravel area has got to be safety, and we have to consider that. We can't be an attractive nuisance. Okay, I'll lead off with a comment. Now, I'm going to have to be bye-bye. I'm going to write my resignation effective after the meeting next Wednesday, because I'll talk a few minutes at that meeting about our first quarter. Then after that, I can't participate in this chair anyway, so that'll be the end of that. Now, I think at the meeting next week, either the reorganization meeting, yeah, it'll be at the reorganization meeting. Which board member is going to be liaison to which committee? And I may or may not be back here as in that position, but very possible. That's really all the news I have.
Well, I guess the other part of that probably is you're clearly going to be vacating the chair position on this committee.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
So we
I'm sorry.
So
Let
we
me
got
rephrase.
so we got to figure out. We got to at least have some thoughts on who might potentially chair this thing
Certainly.
forward.
Because I know our vice chair is just dying to step up to president.
Do we get a new vice chair?
No, I was gonna say, you said more than once. There's no way.
There's no way. Yeah, in terms of when Gary vacates the chair seat, I'll take over. But as Kathy hinted, one of my very high priority items is to find a real, permanent chair who's not me. So
So was that any form of volunteering by mentioning that? Or Jeff's not here, we can always nominate him.
Well, Jeff's not here, but Jeff can't chair two of these activities at the same time. So because he's chairing Fred F, he's kind of out.
That leaves you.
Gary clearly is out. Tom has longevity, on the committee and history on the committee, so I guess I would put it this way, Tom, you'd have right of first refusal, but I think
I refuse.
I think I just heard the refusal.
that is correct.
So,
We don't have to resolve this now.
no,
Yeah.
I
Think
don't,
about
no, we
it.
don't,
But
no, we
think about
don't, but I think at the end of the day, Kathy, that's you and I, so we either go out and arm wrestle for it, or.
And we know that I'm grossly incompetent, so that is not happening.
Yeah, it's,
I can't wait till January, I think
Yeah.
I'm done with that.
yeah.
So and technically, my term expires either this month or next month, but I did let Ella know that I would be willing to continue to serve on this committee, so. I need to send her the proper paperwork for that, so Ella, if you're listening, I apologize, I owe you that piece of paper, but I do need to send that piece of paper.
So that was 21. It was, I've forgotten those, how many went off.
Yeah, I think my term, I apparently was filling in for somebody else and my term expired. It's either the end of this month or the end, and I think it's the end of this month, so I need to send that documentation and then I'll let to make that official, and I'd like to continue to stay on the committee, but assuming that's approved by the board, then I guess I would say I would be willing to take on the chair.
Heck, that's what company.
Well, you as a group probably need to recruit a bit.
Yeah.
If at all possible.
Yeah,
Carl, once all this done, is that Carl Russ might be willing to.
Who?
A guy we interviewed, I guess, for Frat F.
Mhm.
Okay. all right.
He was a number cruncher.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we
Name's good.
definitely need some depth, and
Who knows, you may be asked to analyze or do a research on a hydraulic dredge. You never know what's coming down the pipe between you guys.
I think there are certainly some possibilities out there that
Yeah, possibly.
You just never know.
we could help with. I think at the end of the day, whoever ends up with the chairmanship of this committee probably needs to spend some time with whoever the board representative is, and perhaps some conversations with the board about what, once the new board has a chance to get fire hosed a couple of times about what's going on in the community, and ask them where they would like us to help.
This is a totally general question for other purposes, but when you allocate the annual green fees, I notice you do it, it looks like by course number.
It's
How do
based
you-
off the number of rounds from the prior year
So you
that were
can-
played at each course. And
Okay,
so it's
so it's a
allocated that
general, it's a percentage type thing.
Well,
Because
yeah,
you couldn't go through and see how many rounds were played by an annual player, could you? Or do
Yes,
they-
you can.
They do that every year?
Mhm.
Okay. I think that's, when we talk about fees and other things, that's good data to have.
When we get over on Fred F, when we get over into options development, we may have to see how robust the querying tool is for some of these things, because it might, there's a lot of thoughts out there pretty much everything you could imagine and probably a few things you can't regarding fee structures and all that sort of thing. And it's like, okay, is some of this viable? Is some of it reasonable? You know, is it gonna help? You know, I mean, one of the things that we are trying to evaluate is the administrative overhead of figuring out how much to charge for something worth the effort that you're gonna get back from it. You know, if it costs $100,000 a year of touch labor to get $80,000 worth of additional revenue, well, that doesn't make any sense. So we're trying to find a good balance point there.
Karina, any news, anything you need to bring up?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I have a couple points.
Oh, you're back.
And yes, I'm back. And these are indeed for the minutes. Again, Karina just sent out today
Sorry.
a fair amount of new information. So we're all under the obligation to look at it. And I already have some comments, but please distribute the comments to the group, and then we can then pile on, as like we normally do. Just expect an email from me. I've been taking, I've been looking at the OM tables, and I think in the spirit of what I think I heard Larry say, look for what I call wiggle room in terms of dollars of requests. I have a small opinion that no matter what, it's not going to make a huge difference one way or the other. But I'm going to send out my thoughts on budgeting wiggle room. So anyway. So that's a commitment, and that's it. I guess from a general standpoint, I think we made a lot of progress. A lot of progress. I feel good about it.
Good.
Still a long way to go, but let's just keep working. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for really working together, and I mean helping me a lot tremendously with this project. That's it.
That's saying a lot about a project that nobody could really define precisely, not like an accounting project. Okay?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.